History's greatest cities do not always fall with a bang. Across the globe, the silent stones of 25 ruined capitals tell a far more complicated story. These were not cities destroyed by a single, obvious enemy or cataclysm. Instead, they succumbed to a slow, intricate, and often invisible unraveling that still defies every simple explanation we try to impose. By the end of this journey, you will see the profound patterns and haunting paradoxes behind civilization's most enduring collapses. Why would the rulers of a glittering metropolis systematically burn their own temples? What force could make an entire people walk away from their homes, leaving dinner still on the table? We are about to walk through the echoes of places where archaeology meets its limit and where the quiet itself becomes the greatest mystery of all. What do you believe is the true marker of a society's strength? Our journey begins not with marble columns or grand plazas, but with the quiet, packed earth walls of a place that defied the very idea of a city for thousands of years. In the rolling plains of central Turkey, the ancient settlement of Çatalhöyük rises from the earth like a single, massive organism, a sprawling hive of mud brick homes built so closely together there were no streets at all. To move through this world, you would have walked across the rooftops of your neighbors, descending through a hole in the ceiling into your own small, rectangular chamber. This was a radical urban experiment, a tightly packed community living in what appears to have been a strikingly egalitarian way for over 1,000 years. There were no palaces here, no obvious temples set apart for an elite. The art, the rituals, the burials beneath the floors, all suggest a society that shared its resources and its spiritual life in common. Yet around 5,700 years before the Common Era, this remarkable experiment began to quietly wind down. People stopped repairing the old homes. They ceased building new ones atop the crumbling layers of their ancestors. Over generations, the population simply dwindled until the last family gathered their belongings, climbed out onto the rooftop for the final time, and walked away, leaving their history buried in the mound. The mystery is in that quiet departure. Archaeologists have found no signs of invasion, no layers of ash from a great fire, no mass memorial sites pointing to a single, sudden catastrophe. So what happened? The theories are as layered as the settlement itself. Perhaps centuries of intensive farming and grazing slowly exhausted the land, turning plenty into scarcity. Some researchers suggest health challenges within such a densely packed community, without sanitation or open spaces, may have taken a gradual toll. Others propose a more profound internal shift, a slow transformation of beliefs and social bonds that made the old, hive-like way of life feel confining, pushing families to seek a new, more dispersed existence on the open landscape. The collapse of Çatalhöyük wasn't a dramatic fall, it was a slow fading, a community choosing to dissolve its own unique form rather than see it shattered. The silent, voluntary dispersal of Çatalhöyük stands in stark contrast to the mystery awaiting us on the plains of the Indus River. Here, over 4,000 years ago, rose one of the ancient world's most astonishing and orderly cities, Mohenjo-daro. This was the crowning achievement of the Indus Valley civilization, a society that stretched across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. To walk its streets was to witness urban genius, a masterclass in planning and public welfare laid out with an almost modern precision. The city was a grid of broad, straight avenues with a complex covered drainage system running beneath them, channeling wastewater away from homes and public wells. There were granaries for storing harvests, a monumental public bath for ritual and community life, and standardized bricks used in construction from one end of the civilization to the other. This was not a society that grew by accident, it was built by design, a testament to incredible social organization and a shared vision. And then, around 1900 years before the Common Era, that vision simply faded away. Mohenjo-daro and the entire Indus civilization with it entered a long, slow decline that ended in abandonment. The great puzzle is that its end contains none of the dramatic clues we might expect. Archaeologists have searched in vain for the clear signs that mark so many other fallen capitals. There is no evidence of a sacking by outside armies, no layers of destruction from a massive conflict. The city wasn't burned to the ground, it was gradually, quietly left behind. So what could destabilize a society this advanced, this interconnected? The leading theories point not to a single enemy, but to a changing relationship with the very environment that gave it life. The lifeblood of the Indus cities was the river network, and some research suggests those rivers began to shift their courses. A once reliable water source for irrigation and trade could have become unpredictable, slowly strangling agricultural yields and disrupting the economic bonds between cities. Compounding this, studies of ancient climate data point to a possible prolonged period of drier conditions, a mega-drought that would have placed unbearable stress on even the most sophisticated water management systems. Imagine the slow, creeping crisis, a bureaucracy designed for abundance struggling to manage growing scarcity. The social contracts, the trade networks, the very reason for these dense urban centers could have eroded season by difficult season. The people of Mohenjo-daro didn't necessarily vanish. They may have simply dispersed, adapting to a new, more rural way of life as their grand urban experiment became unsustainable. Their silent departure left behind a city in remarkable physical preservation, but a historical record utterly mute, its final chapter written in dust and shifting river silt, not in conquest or clear catastrophe. The order and predictability of Mohenjo-daro give way to a very different kind of wonder on the island of Crete. Here, the capital was not a grid of streets but a labyrinth. The palace of Knossos, heart of the Minoan civilization, was a sprawling, multi-story complex of over 1,000 rooms, a breathtaking architectural maze of courtyards, storerooms, workshops, and residential quarters. Its vibrant frescoes depicted leaping dolphins, graceful athletes, and serene processions, suggesting a society deeply connected to the sea, ritual, and a certain joyous elegance. For centuries, Knossos was the undisputed center of a maritime trading empire that dominated the Aegean. Then, around the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era, this brilliant world encountered a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. A volcanic island 100 kilometers to the north, known as Thera, exploded in one of the largest eruptions in human history. The event would have been apocalyptic, sending towering tsunamis crashing against the northern coast of Crete, blanketing the island in ash and potentially plunging the region into years of climate disruption from the volcanic winter that followed. For a long time, the story seemed straightforward. The mighty Minoan civilization brought low by a single, natural cataclysm. But the ruins of Knossos tell a more complicated, drawn-out tale. While the eruption undoubtedly caused immense hardship and shattered the Minoan fleet, Knossos itself was not immediately destroyed. The palace shows signs of damage and repair in this period, but life continued. The true end of Knossos as a purely Minoan capital came later, through a slower, more insidious process. In the centuries after the eruption, archaeological evidence shows a clear and growing influence from the mainland Mycenaean Greeks. Their distinct pottery styles, architectural features, and even their linear B script, an early form of Greek used for administrative records, begin to appear within the palace walls. This was not necessarily a sudden, violent conquest, but perhaps a gradual takeover, a cultural and political absorption by a powerful neighbor moving into a power vacuum. The final chapters are murky. The palace complex suffered a major destruction by fire around 1375 before the Common Era, an event that may have been the result of internal conflict, an outside attack, or simply a terrible accident. While the site was reoccupied afterward, it was on a much smaller scale, its grandeur forever faded. The collapse of Knossos, therefore, defies a single villain. It was a layered demise, a staggering natural disaster that weakened the realm, followed by a long period of cultural change and eventual domination, capped by a final, destructive blaze. The labyrinth, it seems, had more than one way to reach a dead end. From the ashes of a labyrinthine palace, we travel inland to a capital built not for beauty, but for sheer, unyielding power. Perched on a rugged plateau in central Anatolia, the walls of Hattusa were a statement carved in stone, declaring the might of the Hittite Empire to the world. This was the nerve center of a military superpower that rivaled ancient Egypt, a fortress city of cyclopean masonry and towering gateways guarded by stone lions and sphinxes. Within its vast precincts lay archives of thousands of clay tablets, detailing treaties, laws, and diplomatic correspondence that stretched across the Near East. Hattusa was the engine of an empire, a meticulously organized administrative machine. And then, around 1,200 years before the Common Era, that machine stopped suddenly and completely. The city was not slowly depopulated, it was purposefully abandoned. The royal archives were carefully buried, the gates were left open, and the entire capital was deserted, its population seemingly vanishing into the highlands. This moment coincides with the great unraveling known as the Bronze Age collapse, a period when palace economies and international trade networks from Greece to Mesopotamia fractured within a generation. The fall of Hattusa is the collapse's central mystery, a puzzle with too many plausible pieces. Traditional history points to the shadowy Sea Peoples, a confederation of maritime raiders blamed for toppling kingdoms across the region. Could a direct assault have breached those legendary walls? Yet excavations find little evidence of a conclusive, destructive battle within the city itself. Another thread suggests internal strife, perhaps rebellions by subject peoples or power struggles within the ruling class that fractured the empire from within. Simultaneously, climate science reveals a telltale clue, a prolonged period of severe drought that gripped the eastern Mediterranean at this exact time. For an empire dependent on grain and tax trade, years of crop failure would have been a disaster, starving the treasury and the people. This environmental stress likely triggered mass movements of desperate populations, which could explain both the Sea Peoples phenomenon and internal migrations that strained the Hittite heartland. But here is the crucial insight. No single one of these threats, invasion, rebellion, or drought, seems sufficient on its own to explain the rapid desertion of such a formidable capital. It was the confluence, the catastrophic synergy of all these pressures at once. A weakened empire facing famine might have withdrawn its frontier armies, leaving coasts vulnerable to raiders. Those raids would then sever the vital copper and tin trade routes needed for weapons and tools, further crippling military and economic response. The resulting scarcity and fear could easily ignite the internal rebellions that finished the job. Hattusa did not fall to a single enemy. It was suffocated by a perfect storm, a cascade of failures where each crisis amplified the next until the great administrative center had no reason to exist, and its people simply walked away from the stone lions, leaving their history buried for 3,000 years. The fall of Hattusa was not an isolated event, but a single tremor in a continent-wide earthquake. Across the Aegean Sea, the Citadel of Mycenae met a similar, shadowy fate. This was the legendary city of Agamemnon, a fortress of such immense stone blocks that later Greeks believed only mythical giants, the Cyclopes, could have built it. From this towering stronghold, the Mycenaean kings ruled a network of palace-centered states, their wealth built on trade, raiding, and a rigid, bureaucratic system recorded in clay with the Linear B script. Mycenae was the archetype of heroic, warlike power, a civilization immortalized in the epics of Homer. Yet by the end of the 12th century before the Common Era, that power was utterly extinguished. The archaeological record here is stark and violent, a clear break marked by widespread fire and destruction. Palace after palace, from Pylos to Turins, shows signs of being burned, their administrative archives baked into permanent ceramic records of their own demise. At Mycenae itself, evidence points to a fierce conflagration. In the wake of this destruction, the population plummeted. The knowledge of writing vanished, intricate craft traditions were lost, and trade routes across the Mediterranean fell silent. This was not a temporary setback, it was a civilizational amnesia, a descent into a simpler, poorer, and isolated age that historians call the Greek Dark Ages. The question that has haunted archaeologists for generations is simple: who or what delivered the killing blow? The suspects are many, yet each leaves room for doubt. One long-held theory points to an invasion by a new wave of Greek-speaking people, the Dorians, moving down from the north. Yet the evidence for a massive, destructive migration at this specific time is surprisingly thin in the archaeological layers. Another compelling idea suggests internal warfare, a series of conflicts between the rival Mycenaean palaces themselves, a catastrophic civil war that consumed the entire system. Could competition for dwindling resources have turned allies into enemies until no palace was left standing? Simultaneously, the same climate data that points to drought for the Hittites also reveals a period of significant aridity and crop failure in Greece. A succession of poor harvests would have fatally undermined the palace economies, which relied on taxing grain to support the warriors, artisans, and scribes. Starvation and social unrest could have sparked those internal rebellions or made the kingdoms vulnerable to smaller-scale raids from sea or land. The truth likely lies in that dangerous synergy again. Environmental stress may have weakened the social fabric, economic collapse could have ignited internal strife, and in that moment of profound vulnerability, any combination of raids, uprisings, or system failure would have been catastrophic. The great Citadel of Mycenae did not fall to a single, named enemy, but to a perfect storm of crises that shattered the complex system holding it all together, leaving only the giant stones of the Lion Gate to stare out over a silent, darkened landscape. The silence that followed Mycenae's fall finds a strange echo in a place that was never truly silent, the spiritual heart of an entire civilization. For over a millennium, the city of Thebes was more than just a capital of Egypt, it was a divine address. Known as Waset to the ancients, it was the city of the god Ammon, a deity whose power and wealth became so intertwined with the state that the pharaohs of the New Kingdom ruled as his chief priests. Thebes was a testament in stone to this sacred partnership, its landscape dominated by the colossal temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor, where endless rows of sphinxes led to hypostyle halls with pillars carved like towering papyrus plants. This was not a city that collapsed in fire and ruin like the others. Its end was a far more subtle and prolonged fading, a story of how a civilization's spiritual center can be slowly emptied of its meaning by the shifting sands of political power. Thebes's golden age coincided with the New Kingdom, when Egypt was an empire stretching from Nubia to the Euphrates. The wealth of conquered lands flowed into the treasuries of Ammon, making his priesthood arguably the most powerful and wealthy institution in the world. But this very success planted the seeds of a quiet crisis. The immense authority of the Theban priests began to rival that of the pharaohs themselves, creating a tension between the throne and the altar. This power struggle reached its dramatic climax with the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten. In a religious revolution that shook Egypt to its core, Akhenaten rejected the entire pantheon, especially the mighty Ammon of Thebes. He moved the capital north to a brand new city he called Akhetaten, dedicated solely to the worship of the sun disk, the Aten. Overnight, Thebes was spiritually and politically sidelined, its temples neglected, its priesthood disempowered. While Akhenaten's revolution died with him, and later pharaohs like Tutankhamun restored the old gods, the damage to Thebes's invincible image was done. The precedent was set. A pharaoh could simply choose to build a new capital, and the center of gravity could shift, and shift it did. Subsequent rulers, wary of the entrenched power in Thebes, increasingly governed from cities in the Nile Delta, closer to trade routes and military frontiers in the Near East. The real political power drifted north to places like Pi-Ramesses, built by the great Rameses II. Thebes remained immensely wealthy and religiously vital, but it was no longer the undisputed seat of empire. It was becoming a magnificent museum of past glory, a holy city living on its legacy. The final, brutal punctuation to this long decline came from outside. In the 7th century before the Common Era, the Assyrian Empire, a relentless military machine from Mesopotamia, marched up the Nile. Thebes, still a symbol of Egyptian splendor, was sacked and looted, a shocking desecration from which it never fully recovered as a political force. So the story of Thebes is not one of sudden oblivion, but of a slow, multifaceted diminishment. It was weakened by internal religious upheaval, made obsolete by the practical needs of a changing empire, and finally violated by a foreign conqueror. Its temples still stand in awe-inspiring ruin, not because the city was destroyed, but because its role as the divine heart of the world was gradually, irrevocably transferred elsewhere, leaving the stone giants of Karnak to preside over a glorious, empty sanctuary. The stone giants of Karnak were witnesses to a power that could shift, but the walls of Nineveh were built to proclaim a power that would never bend. On the east bank of the Tigris River, the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was not merely a city, it was a terrifying declaration in mud, brick, and limestone. Its walls, so wide chariots could race along their tops, stretched for over 12 kilometers, encircling palaces, temples, and gardens fed by a complex system of canals and aqueducts. Within its gates lay the legendary library of Ashurbanipal, a vast archive of tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets collecting the knowledge, literature, and omens of Mesopotamia. Nineveh was the ultimate apex predator of the ancient world, the administrative and military nerve center of an empire that used calculated, overwhelming force to dominate the Near East for centuries. Its fall in 612 before the Common Era is one of history's most vividly recorded events. A coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and others, long subjugated by Assyria, finally united and laid siege to the impregnable city. After a brutal campaign, they broke through, sacking and burning the capital with a thoroughness that echoed through the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. The event was so seismic it became a universal symbol of divine retribution against arrogance. Yet, the deeper, more puzzling mystery is not the city's destruction, but what happened immediately afterward, the sheer completeness of the empire's vanishing act. In the space of just a few years following Nineveh's fall, the entire Assyrian state, an edifice of such immense power and complexity, simply ceased to exist. There was no prolonged civil war, no successor state rising from the ashes, no remnant dynasty holding onto a fraction of the territory. The empire evaporated, leaving a startling power vacuum that new kingdoms would rush to fill. This total and sudden erasure is what truly defies expectation. How could a system so formidable leave no trace of itself to carry on? The answer may lie in the very nature of Assyrian power itself. This was an empire built on extreme centralization and a culture of institutionalized intimidation. Provinces were ruled not by loyal local elites, but by Assyrian governors directly answerable to the king in Nineveh. Their armies were unmatched, but their rule often relied on a policy of calculated terror. the mass relocation of conquered peoples to break their ties to the land, and public displays of harsh punishment for rebels. This system created immense wealth and stability, but at a profound cost. It forged an empire with no true allies, only terrified subjects and embittered enemies waiting for a moment of weakness. All loyalty, all administrative continuity, all cultural cohesion was funneled directly back to the throne and the capital city. So when that throne was toppled and that capital was reduced to smoldering rubble, there was nothing left to hold the empire together. No other city could command the same authority. No provincial leader had the legitimacy to rally the people, because the system had been designed to prevent any rival center of power from ever emerging. The conquered nations, seeing the lion was dead, did not mourn. They simply walked away and reclaimed their independence. Nineveh's collapse was catastrophic, but the empire's disappearance was a direct result of its own brutal logic, a stunning lesson in how absolute control can become an absolute vulnerability, leaving behind only a library buried in ash and a warning etched into history itself. The Assyrian Empire vanished with a shocking finality, but the story of Mesopotamia was far from over. It would find its last, most magnificent expression in a city whose name alone conjures images of hanging gardens and towering ziggurats, Babylon. This was a capital with a uniquely cyclical destiny, a city that did not simply rise and fall once, but was destroyed, rebuilt, and reimagined across centuries. At its peak under rulers like Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon was the awe-inspiring center of the known world, a metropolis of glazed blue bricks, massive fortifications like the Ishtar Gate, and legendary engineering marvels. Its hanging gardens were counted among the wonders of the ancient world, and its scholarly traditions in astronomy and law were unparalleled. This was a city built to be eternal. Its final chapter, however, began not with a dramatic siege, but with a surprisingly peaceful transition of power. In 539 before the Common Era, the Persian king Cyrus the Great entered Babylon, not as a brutal conqueror, but portrayed in contemporary records as a liberator, respecting the city's temples and traditions. This moment is often seen as a graceful end, but the true collapse of Babylon was not this political conquest. It was the slow, mundane decay that followed over the next several centuries. The Persian Empire, and later the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire that succeeded it, had vast, sprawling territories to manage. While Babylon remained an important regional center, it was no longer the singular, pulsating heart of an empire. The administrative focus shifted. New capitals like Persepolis and later Seleucia were founded, drawing away the royal court, the bureaucrats, the diplomats, and the flow of tribute that had sustained Babylon's extravagant economy. Perhaps more critically, the very landscape began to turn against the city. Babylon's lifeblood was the Euphrates River and the intricate network of canals engineered to irrigate its fields and bring goods to its docks. Maintaining this hydraulic system required constant, centralized labor and expertise, a colossal public works project that only a fully invested, resident monarchy could organize and fund. As imperial attention drifted elsewhere, that maintenance inevitably declined. Canals silted up, fields that once produced surplus grain became less reliable. The river itself may have slowly shifted its course over time, a common phenomenon in Mesopotamia, leaving parts of the city's elaborate quays high and dry. Trade routes once funneled through Babylon's gates began to bypass it for newer, better connected cities. This was a death by 1,000 cuts, a gradual draining of political significance, economic vitality, and finally, population. People followed opportunity and stability, migrating to the new centers of power. The great city, deprived of the constant care that had built it, began a long, irreversible shrinking. By the time of the Parthian Empire in the 1st century of the Common Era, classical writers described a Babylon that was largely a ruin, its vast space mostly empty, a sight for tourists and scholars to marvel at what had been. So the fall of Babylon defies the simple story of a conquering army at the gates. It was a slow-motion abandonment, a demonstration that even the greatest city is a living organism that requires constant nourishment. And when the empire that built it moves on, taking that sustenance with it, even walls of blue-glazed brick cannot hold back the silent, patient advance of dust and forgetting. The slow decay of Babylon reveals a profound truth that a city can outlive its own purpose. But there is another kind of end, one that arrives not with a whimper, but with a world historical bang. On a vast stone platform in the heart of modern-day Iran, the ruins of Persepolis stand as a ghostly monument to that moment. This was the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a place not for everyday governance but for breathtaking imperial theater. Built by kings like Darius the Great and Xerxes, it was designed to stun and humble. Foreign delegations from every corner of the known world, from India to Ethiopia, would climb the monumental staircases, passing carved reliefs of tribute-bearers to approach the king in his audience hall. Persepolis was the ultimate stage for the empire's power, a symbol of its divine ordained order and unimaginable reach. Its physical end is one of the most famous acts of destruction in antiquity. In 330 before the Common Era, Alexander the Great, having defeated the Persian armies, reached the city. Historical accounts describe a great feast, and then, in a fateful moment, the palace complex was set ablaze. Whether it was a deliberate act of policy, a symbolic closing of a chapter, or the result of a drunken revelry gone wrong, the result was the same. The heart of Persian ceremonial power was reduced to scorched columns and blackened stone. The burning itself is not the mystery, it is a stark historical fact. The deeper puzzle lies in what happened immediately afterward, and the sheer finality of it all. The Achaemenid Empire, which had ruled for over 2 centuries, disintegrated with astonishing speed following this event, and Persepolis, unlike many other ruined capitals, was never rebuilt, never reclaimed as a seat of power. It was abandoned to the sands, its role as a capital permanently extinguished. Why would such a resonant symbol be left to die? The answer may be found in the very nature of the empire it represented. The Achaemenid state was a masterpiece of administration, with satraps governing provinces and a royal road system connecting them. But at its core, it was profoundly king-centric. The empire was not an abstract idea of Persia, it was the divine property of the King of Kings. All loyalty, all political legitimacy, all ceremonial focus flowed directly to and from the person of the monarch. Persepolis was the ultimate expression of that bond, a stone hymn to the glory of the throne. When Alexander defeated the last Achaemenid king, Darius III, and then burned the ceremonial capital, he did more than destroy buildings, he shattered the central pillar of the entire imperial system. There was no separate, deeply rooted national identity or bureaucratic institution that could survive independently of the monarchy. The satraps, now lacking a central source of authority and legitimacy, had little to unite them. Some joined Alexander, others fought for their own ends, but the cohesive empire vanished because its symbolic and administrative heart had been ripped out simultaneously. Persepolis was left as a ruin because the concept it enshrined, the absolute, godlike Persian monarchy, was seen as finished. New rulers like Alexander and his successors would build their own capitals elsewhere, their own stages for a new world order. The silent, fire-scarred columns of Persepolis thus tell a story about the fragility of even the mightiest empires when they are built too perfectly around a single, vulnerable idea, leaving a magnificent shell that no one had any reason to fill again. From the smoldering ruins of a king-centered empire, we sail west across the Mediterranean to a capital built not by a monarch's decree, but by a merchant's ledger. Carthage began as a modest trading post, a colony of the seafaring Phoenicians from the city of Tyre. Its genius was not in monumental architecture, at least not at first, but in a ruthless, pragmatic brilliance for commerce and naval power. Nestled on a superb natural harbor in modern-day Tunisia, Carthage grew fat on the trade of silver, tin, ivory, and the precious purple dye that was its signature. It evolved into a thalassocracy, a maritime empire that controlled the sea lanes of the western Mediterranean, establishing colonies of its own from Sicily to Spain. This was a republic governed by a council of wealthy merchant families, a state where profit and power were inextricably linked. Its legendary destruction by Rome in 146 before the Common Era is one of history's most famous endings, the city famously sown with salt. But that final, brutal act was merely the punctuation on a sentence that had been written over decades of deeper, more systemic vulnerabilities. The first great weakness lay in the very source of its strength, the sea. Carthage was an island of Punic culture on the North African coast, its wealth flowing in from distant colonies and trading partners, not from the fertile lands immediately surrounding it. This created a precarious relationship with the local Berber populations of the interior. Carthage often treated these communities not as allies or integrated citizens, but as subjects to be taxed and recruited as mercenaries for its armies. This was a cost-effective strategy for a mercantile state, but it built a foundation of resentment, not loyalty. When crisis came, these local populations could become a lethal internal threat, as seen in the bloody mercenary war that nearly tore Carthage apart after its first defeat by Rome. The city's elite, focused on overseas wealth, had failed to build a cohesive, rooted nation at home. This leads to the second fatal flaw, a strategic inconsistency born of its commercial soul. Carthaginian strategy often appeared reactive, even improvisational, compared to the relentless, long-term focus of the Roman Republic. Decisions could be swayed by commercial interests or the rivalries of leading families, leading to a lack of sustained commitment in crucial conflicts. The legendary General Hannibal Barca understood Roman resolve better than his own government did. After his stunning victories in Italy, including the annihilation of a Roman army at Cannae, he waited in vain for the reinforcements and political support from Carthage that never arrived in decisive force. The city's leadership, perhaps divided or more concerned with protecting trade routes elsewhere, failed to press its greatest advantage. This highlights a profound disconnect. While Carthage could produce military genius, its political system could not consistently marshal the total national will required to defeat an opponent like Rome, for whom the war was an existential struggle. Ultimately, Rome did not just defeat Carthage in battle, it systematically dismantled the conditions for its existence. After the Second Punic War, crippling reparations and the loss of its overseas empire strangled Carthage's economy. When the city showed signs of economic recovery decades later, a paranoid Rome, embodying the famous phrase Carthago delenda isti, demanded the unthinkable, that the Carthaginians abandon their coastal city and move inland. This was a death sentence for a civilization whose identity and survival were tied to the sea. The refusal sparked the Third Punic War, a foregone conclusion that ended with the city's thorough erasure. The tragedy of Carthage is that its collapse was not merely a military defeat. It was the failure of a brilliant but narrowly focused commercial power to build the deep-rooted, resilient society needed to survive a total war against a nation of farmers and soldiers. The Romans salted the earth, but the fields of distrust and strategic short-sightedness had been barren long before. While Carthage's fate was sealed by a rival empire, the story of Pataliputra reveals a capital that faded from within, its grandeur dissolving under the weight of its own success. On the fertile plains where the Ganges and Sun rivers meet, this city was the pulsing heart of not one, but two of India's golden ages. First as the capital of the vast Mauryan Empire under the great Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and later as the seat of the Gupta dynasty 1,000 years later. Pataliputra was a metropolis of staggering scale and sophistication. Classical accounts from Greek ambassadors describe a city protected by a massive timber palisade with hundreds of towers and gates, its streets bustling with markets, artisans, and scholars. It was a center of global learning and political thought, a place where empires that spanned the subcontinent were administered with remarkable efficiency. Yet after the reign of the Gupta kings around the 6th century of the Common Era, this colossal city enters a historical twilight. It did not suffer a dramatic, recorded sacking like Nineveh or Carthage. Instead, it underwent a slow, perplexing diminishment, retreating from a world capital to a regional town, its final centuries as a major center shrouded in frustrating silence. The puzzle for historians is the lack of a single, catastrophic event to point to. Instead, they see a confluence of pressures that gradually unraveled the centralized power Pataliputra embodied. One major theory points to invasions from Central Asia, particularly by the Huna peoples, nomadic groups whose relentless incursions in the 5th and 6th centuries battered the northern frontiers of the Gupta realm. These were not necessarily aimed at capturing and holding a giant city, but their repeated raids would have severely disrupted the long-distance trade routes and agricultural stability that fed the empire's treasury, slowly bleeding the capital of its economic vitality. More profound than any external raid, however, was an internal political shift. The Gupta Empire and the idea of a pan-Indian state began to fragment due to decentralization. Local governors and regional kings, once firmly under the control of the Gupta court in Pataliputra, began to assert their own autonomy. Power and patronage drifted away from the imperial center to these smaller, competing courts across the subcontinent. Why maintain loyalty to a distant capital when local rulers could offer protection and opportunity? This political diffusion meant the vast flows of tribute, talent, and ambition that had sustained Pataliputra's greatness were gradually redirected elsewhere. Compounding this, some researchers suggest subtle environmental changes on the Gangetic Plain may have played a role. Shifts in river courses, patterns of flooding, or even periods of soil exhaustion from centuries of intensive farming could have slowly altered the agricultural bounty that supported such a dense urban population. The most striking aspect of Pataliputra's mystery, however, is the silence in the ground itself. Unlike the clear ash layers of a burned city or the shattered walls of a conquest, the archaeological evidence for its final decline is elusive. Much of ancient Pataliputra lies buried beneath the modern city of Patna, making large-scale excavation difficult. What has been found shows a city that shrank and changed, but not one that was violently erased. The grand wooden walls rotted away, the great administrative buildings were not replaced, and the urban fabric simply contracted over centuries. The collapse of Pataliputra, therefore, is a story of a capital becoming obsolete. It was not destroyed by an enemy, but made gradually irrelevant by the fragmenting of its own political universe, the redirection of economic currents, and the quiet challenges of a changing landscape. The city that once commanded an empire became a memory in the land, its world historical role ending not with a bang, but with the slow, persistent whisper of time and shifting loyalties. The slow fading of Pataliputra into regional obscurity stands in stark contrast to a city whose end was marked not by quiet forgetting, but by fire and fury. In the highlands of central Mexico, the Avenue of the Dead cuts a silent, monumental path through the ruins of Teotihuacan, a metropolis so vast and so powerful that the Aztecs who found its ruins centuries later could only believe it was built by gods. At its peak around the year 450 of the Common Era, this was one of the largest cities on Earth, home to perhaps 125,000 people. Its skyline was dominated by the colossal Pyramid of the Sun and the slightly smaller Pyramid of the Moon, structures that embodied a cosmic order and a concentration of human labor that is still breathtaking. Yet for all its grandeur, Teotihuacan guards its most fundamental secrets with an iron silence. We do not know what its people called themselves. We have never found a royal tomb, a palace clearly identified for a single ruler, or any inscriptions that name a king or a dynasty. This was a city of immense collective power, seemingly governed in a way that deliberately obscured individual leaders. And then, around the middle of the 6th century, this meticulously ordered world came apart in a wave of deliberate destruction. The evidence uncovered by archaeologists is both vivid and chilling. Around the year 550, key ceremonial and elite residential compounds along the Avenue of the Dead were systematically set ablaze. This was not a random city fire or the collateral damage of an invasion. The burning was targeted and ritualistic. Statues of deities were smashed, their fragments scattered. Elaborate murals were defaced. The very symbols of the city's ruling authority and spiritual power were violently attacked. The city's heart was not conquered, it was purged. After this event, Teotihuacan did not vanish overnight. A smaller population continued to live among the ruins for generations, but its power as a dominant capital, as the gravitational center of Mesoamerica, was irrevocably broken. The central mystery is the complete absence of any sign of an external enemy. There is no evidence of a foreign army, no new cultural artifacts suddenly appearing in the layers of ash, no fortified last stands. The violence came from within the city's own walls. This points powerfully to a massive internal revolt, a popular uprising against the ruling class and the religious ideology that sustained them. For centuries, Teotihuacan's society had been highly stratified, with a small elite living in spacious palace compounds adorned with beautiful frescoes, while the vast majority lived in more modest apartments. The city's economy and its grand construction projects relied on this organized social hierarchy. Over time, however, the burdens placed on the common people to maintain this system may have become intolerable. Some researchers point to signs of increasing social stress in the centuries before the collapse, including evidence of poorer health among the lower classes. Compounding this social tension was likely environmental pressure. Studies of ancient climate records, including lake sediments and tree rings, suggest the 6th century was a time of severe and prolonged droughts in central Mexico. For a city of that immense size, dependent on agriculture to feed its masses, a series of crop failures would have been catastrophic. Famine would have shattered the social contract. If the ruling priesthood and elites were seen as failing in their most fundamental duty, to intercede with the gods for rain and fertility, their authority would have evaporated. The people might have concluded that the gods themselves had abandoned the city's rulers, and in a final, desperate act, taken matters into their own hands, burning the temples and the elite quarters in a revolutionary fire meant to cleanse and restart their world. The collapse of Teotihuacan, therefore, presents a haunting scenario, a civilization that may have been toppled not by a foreign sword, but by its own people, rising against a system that could no longer sustain them under the relentless pressure of a changing sky. The city of the gods was not sacked, it was sacrificed from within, leaving behind pyramids that point silently at a heaven that had perhaps turned to ash. The revolutionary fire that consumed Teotihuacan's elite sent a tremor through Mesoamerica, but far to the southeast, in the dense rainforests of Guatemala, another civilization was building its own version of the cosmos in stone. Tikal was not just a Maya city, it was a titan. During the Classic period, its soaring limestone pyramids, some rising over 200 feet above the jungle canopy, were the very axis of a powerful and sophisticated world. For centuries, its kings, known as Kuhul Ajor or Holy Lords, claimed direct communion with the gods and ancestors, their reigns recorded on intricately carved stone monuments called stelae. The city was a marvel of engineering and artistry, sustained by vast reservoirs to capture rainwater and a network of causeways connecting its grand plazas. Its influence stretched across the Maya world, shaping politics, trade, and culture. Then, in the 9th century of the Common Era, the carvings stopped. The last dated monument at Tikal was erected in 869. Within a generation or two, the great city was all but empty. Its royal dynasty and urban elite vanished, leaving the silent pyramids to be swallowed by the relentless green embrace of the forest. This was not an isolated event, but part of the broader Maya collapse, yet Tikal's own trajectory reveals a chillingly specific recipe for disaster. The evidence points to a catastrophic convergence of environmental and human factors. First, and most critically, was a prolonged and severe drought. Scientific data from lake sediments and stalagmites in the region show a series of intense dry periods, peaking in the 9th century, precisely when Tikal and other cities fell. For a society entirely dependent on seasonal rainfall, where reservoirs were the difference between life and famine, a multi-year failure of the rains would have been apocalyptic. Crops would have withered, the precious water stores would have dwindled, and the social order would have begun to crack under the weight of hunger and thirst. But the people of Tikal did not simply wait for the end. Archaeologists have uncovered clear signs of escalating warfare in the city's final century. Defensive earthworks, large ditches and berms were hastily constructed around the city's core, a desperate attempt to fortify the heart of the kingdom against attack. This was not the glorious, ritualized warfare of earlier times to capture nobles for sacrifice. This was total war, born of fear and scarcity. As resources disappeared, neighboring city-states, likely suffering the same drought, would have turned on each other, fighting for control of the last remaining arable land or reliable water sources. This warfare further fractured the political landscape, destroying trade networks that cities relied on for essential goods like obsidian for tools and salt for preserving food. The final blow was likely political and spiritual. The holy lords of Tikal derived their power from a sacred covenant. They ensured the favor of the gods, who in turn provided rain and prosperity. When the rains failed for years, despite ever more extreme rituals and sacrifices, that covenant was broken in the eyes of the people. The king's divine authority evaporated. The intricate system of tribute and labor that built the pyramids and fed the elite would have collapsed as faith turned to disillusionment and then to anger. The process was not a single event, but a grim spiral. Drought led to crop failure, which sparked warfare and political fragmentation, which in turn made coordinated responses to the environmental crisis impossible. The royal court, its legitimacy shattered, may have been overthrown or simply abandoned by a populace that could no longer sustain it. The common people, those who survived the conflict and hunger, likely dispersed into smaller, more sustainable communities in the countryside, returning to a simpler way of life. Tikal's grand plazas, once thronged with people during sacred ceremonies, were left to the howler monkeys and strangler figs, a haunting testament to a civilization that mastered the stars and the seasons, but could not survive when the skies themselves turned to stone. The silence that swallowed Tikal was echoed in the lush valley of Copán, a Maya city that turned its river into a canvas for cosmic art. Here, the collapse did not arrive with the sudden violence of warfare, but unfolded like a slow, mournful symphony, its final notes written in failing cornfields and a dynasty's fading prestige. Copán was renowned across the Maya world as a center of sublime artistic expression and astronomical precision. Its hieroglyphic stairway, a monumental staircase inscribed with over 2,000 glyphs, is the longest known text from ancient America, a stone library narrating the divine history of its 16 kings. Its sculptors produced stelae of such intricate, lifelike detail that they seemed to breathe, capturing the holy lords in moments of ritual power and connection to the ancestors. This was a capital of courtly refinement, where knowledge of the stars and the flow of time was woven into the very fabric of governance. Yet this brilliance masked a vulnerability that would prove fatal. a story told not by ash and defensive walls, but by the quiet words on those same stone monuments. The glyphs themselves provide the first clue to the unraveling. The historical record carved in stone becomes sparse and then stops entirely after the reign of the 16th king, whose name is significantly Yaks Passage Chan Yopot, meaning first dawn of the sky lightning god. His reign, beginning in the mid-8th century, coincides with the start of Copán's visible decline. The texts hint at political troubles, including failed military campaigns and an inability to secure advantageous marriages with other royal families. The prestige of the royal house, that sacred aura essential for commanding labor and tribute, was visibly eroding. The lightning god's dawn, it seemed, was followed by a long, gathering twilight. Compounding this dynastic weakening was a problem rooted in the very ground of the valley itself. Copán's population had grown tremendously over centuries, becoming one of the densest in the Maya world. To feed everyone, the surrounding hillsides were extensively cleared for terraced agriculture. This deforestation, however, triggered severe environmental degradation. Scientific studies of the valley's soil layers show dramatic increases in erosion during the city's final centuries. With the tree cover gone, seasonal rains washed the fertile topsoil down from the hills and into the Copán River, silting up the bottomlands. The agricultural foundation of the kingdom was literally washing away, reducing crop yields at the very moment the political system was losing its grip. The result was not a sudden, dramatic famine, but a long, grinding depletion of resources. We see evidence of a slow depopulation, a gradual dispersal of people from the urban core and the valley floor. Some families may have moved to smaller, more sustainable plots in the surrounding highlands. Others might have been drawn away to the households of still rising rival nobles within the kingdom as central authority fragmented. The brilliant courtly culture, dependent on a large population to sustain its artists, astronomers, and monument builders, simply could not maintain its complexity. The final acts were quiet. The last known monument was erected in the early 9th century. Construction on grand projects ceased. The royal palace compounds were eventually abandoned. Unlike Tikal, there is little evidence of a violent, cataclysmic end at Copán's heart. Instead, the city experienced a slow-motion dissolution, a brilliant culture dimming because the dynastic flame could no longer ignite loyalty, and the land itself could no longer support the grand vision built upon it. The sculptors laid down their tools, the astronomers turned their eyes from the stars to more immediate worries, and the last king of Copán walked away from a throne that commanded nothing but memories, leaving the exquisite stone portraits of his ancestors to watch over a valley slowly returning to forest. Across the ocean, another civilization built its capital not for gods or kings, but for the quiet, steady flow of commerce. In the southern highlands of Africa, the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe rise from the savannah, a silent city of granite curves and towering enclosures constructed without a single drop of mortar. For centuries, European explorers and colonizers refused to believe such a sophisticated structure could be the work of African hands, attributing it instead to mythical figures like the Queen of Sheba or lost Phoenician traders. This racist fantasy was a profound historical injustice, obscuring the true story of a powerful indigenous Shona kingdom that reached its zenith between the 11th and 15th centuries. Great Zimbabwe was the beating heart of a vast trading network, a place where gold from inland mines, ivory from elephant herds, and copper from distant deposits were exchanged for fine Chinese celadon pottery, Persian glass, and Indian cloth brought by Swahili merchants from the coast. The very layout of the city spoke to its purpose, with the hill complex likely serving as a spiritual and royal residence. The iconic great enclosure below perhaps a ritual space or a royal court, and the surrounding valley filled with the dwellings of a thriving population that may have numbered over 10,000. This was a center of wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. Its very stones a testament to a society in full command of its destiny. Yet, by the middle of the 15th century, this magnificent stone city was abandoned. The great trading hub fell silent, its people departing, leaving behind only the empty, wind-swept enclosures. The mystery is not one of invasion or conquest, for there is no evidence of a destructive attack. Instead, the abandonment points to a slow, internal unraveling, a series of pressures that made this specific location unsustainable. One compelling theory centers on environmental exhaustion. Supporting such a large, concentrated population required immense resources, timber for building and fuel, and extensive grazing land for cattle, which were central to both wealth and diet. Centuries of intensive use may have gradually deforested the surrounding area and overgrazed the grasslands, leading to soil erosion and a decline in the local carrying capacity. The land, quite simply, may have been worn out. A second major factor was likely economic. Great Zimbabwe's power was built on its control of the gold trade routes to the Indian Ocean. If those routes shifted due to political changes on the coast, or if new sources of gold were discovered elsewhere, the city's economic lifeline would have been severed. The wealth that sustained its elite and its grand construction projects would have slowly dried up. Finally, there is the possibility of political fragmentation. As resources dwindled and trade declined, the central authority that held the kingdom together may have weakened. Competing factions or sub-chiefs could have broken away, establishing their own, smaller centers of power in areas with fresher resources. The population, following opportunity and leadership, would have dispersed. The departure from Great Zimbabwe, therefore, appears to have been a pragmatic, if sorrowful, decision. The people did not vanish. They likely moved and reorganized, founding new settlements like Kome and Danangom that carried on the Shona cultural tradition. The stone capital was left as a magnificent shell, not because of a catastrophic failure, but because the complex web of environmental, economic, and social conditions that created it had fundamentally changed. It stands as a monument not to a sudden collapse, but to the inevitable migration of human centers when the balance between a people and their place in the world can no longer be maintained. The pragmatic dispersal from Great Zimbabwe's stone enclosures finds a startling parallel in a city that mastered water, only to be undone by its absence. In the humid lowlands of Cambodia, the Khmer capital of Angkor was a feat of hydraulic engineering on an almost unimaginable scale. At its heart stood the Temple of Angkor Wat, a microcosm of the Hindu universe carved in sandstone, its 5 towers representing the peaks of Mount Meru. But the true genius of Angkor lay not just in its temples, but in what lay between them, a sprawling, intricate network of canals, reservoirs called barrays, and moats that transformed the landscape. This system was the lifeblood of the empire, designed to capture monsoon rains, store water for the long dry season, and irrigate vast rice paddies that could support a population nearing 1 million people. For centuries, this managed landscape allowed Angkor to flourish as the largest pre-industrial city in the world. Its collapse, long simplistically blamed on a Thai invasion in the 15th century, is now understood as a far more layered and gradual process. Recent archaeological evidence, particularly from sediment cores drilled from the city's great reservoirs, tells a story of environmental overreach and climatic misfortune. The cores reveal that Angkor's magnificent water network was not a static achievement, but a system under constant, increasing stress. The sediment layers show periods of extremely high erosion in the centuries leading up to the city's decline. This suggests the surrounding hillsides were heavily deforested, likely to expand agriculture and to fuel the kilns that produced the stone for Angkor's endless construction projects. This deforestation would have destabilized the very watershed the system depended on, causing canals to silt up more rapidly and reducing the system's efficiency. Then came the climate. Analysis of tree rings from the region points to a severe and prolonged period of drought in the 14th century, interspersed with years of intense, damaging monsoon floods. This 1-2 punch of climatic extremes would have been catastrophic for Angkor's delicate hydraulic balance. A prolonged drought would have emptied the barrays and parched the rice fields. The intricate bureaucracy that managed water distribution would have faced impossible choices, likely favoring elite precincts and temples, sowing deep social discontent among the farmers who fed the city. When the intense floods finally came, the denuded landscape, stripped of its forest cover, would have unleashed torrents of silt-laden water, overwhelming and clogging the already compromised canals and reservoirs. The system, pushed beyond its designed limits by both human activity and a changing climate, began to fail. This environmental and infrastructural crisis would have severely weakened the kingdom, making it vulnerable to the pressures that followed. The capital did not fall in a single siege. It was gradually, strategically abandoned. By the 15th century, the Khmer kings had shifted their political center southward, closer to the maritime trade of the Mekong Delta and perhaps to more reliable water sources. Angkor itself was not completely deserted overnight, but its role as a grand capital was over. Without the immense, centralized labor force required to maintain the water network, the jungle began its slow, patient reconquest. The mighty stone temples, built for eternity, were slowly embraced by the roots of strangler figs, becoming the haunting, beautiful ruins we see today. Angkor's story is a profound lesson in the vulnerability of even the most advanced infrastructure, a reminder that a civilization's greatest achievement can become its most critical point of failure when the environment it was built to control decides to change the rules. The silent, root-entwined temples of Angkor speak of a civilization overwhelmed by the very environment it sought to command. Yet a different kind of silence, one born of fertile soil and immense communal effort, blankets the great earthen mounds across the river from modern St. Louis. Here, in the American bottom floodplain, the city of Cahokia once thrived, a bustling metropolis that was the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico. At its zenith around the year 1100, its population may have reached 20,000 people, a number that would not be seen again in the region until the late 18th century. The city's skyline was dominated by Monk's Mound, a colossal, flat-topped earthen pyramid larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, flanked by over 100 smaller mounds that served as platforms for temples, elite residences, and memorial sites. Grand plazas hosted bustling markets and ceremonial games, while a wooden stockade, rebuilt multiple times, encircled the city's sacred core. This was a place of astonishing political and spiritual power, a chiefdom that influenced cultures across the mid-continent. And then, just a few centuries before European ships ever touched the Americas, this vibrant hub was completely abandoned. By the 14th century, the plazas were empty, the great mounds were silent, and the people had vanished, leaving behind no written record, no oral history passed to successor tribes, only the earthworks themselves as a monumental question mark. The mystery of Cahokia's end is profound because its rise was so spectacularly rapid. Archaeological evidence suggests the city coalesced in a virtual explosion of growth over just a few generations, drawing people from across the region into a new, centralized way of life. This very speed, however, may have contributed to its fragility. The first clear sign of trouble is the cessation of major public works. The construction of new mounds slows, then stops entirely. The Great Defensive Wall, a project requiring thousands of logs and immense coordinated labor, is rebuilt for a final time and then never again. This tells us the social engine, the ability to mobilize and direct the population toward colossal communal projects, was breaking down. What could cause such a failure? One primary suspect is climate. studies of ancient climate proxies, including tree rings and sediment cores, point to a significant period of cooler, wetter conditions in the mid-continent beginning in the 12th century. For a society dependent on maize agriculture in a floodplain, this shift could have been disastrous. Longer, colder springs might have shortened the growing season, while increased flooding could have repeatedly wiped out crops planted along the rich riverbanks. A succession of poor harvests would have strained the social contract to its breaking point. The city's powerful leaders, who likely derived their authority from ensuring agricultural abundance and organizing surplus, would have faced a crisis of legitimacy when the rains and the sun failed to cooperate. This environmental stress likely ignited the second major factor: social unrest and political fragmentation. The evidence here is subtle but telling. The final rebuilding of the massive stockade wall is particularly significant. This was not a wall designed for occasional external raids. It was a formidable, resource-intensive barrier. Its repeated construction suggests a society turning inward, fortifying its sacred core against its own people or against neighboring groups that were once allies. Tensions may have risen between a struggling populace and an elite class that continued to live atop the mounds, removed from the hardships below. As resources dwindled, outlying communities that once looked to Cahokia for leadership and trade may have severed their ties, choosing self-reliance over loyalty to a faltering center. The intricate network of exchange and allegiance that held the chiefdom together began to unravel. People did not necessarily die out, they likely voted with their feet. Over decades, families and kinship groups probably made the rational choice to disperse back into the smaller, more resilient and sustainable villages from which they had come. They returned to a lifestyle that was less impressive, but far more adaptable to the changing climate and the failure of centralized authority. By the 1300s, Cahokia was essentially a ghost city, its mounds standing as lonely sentinels over empty plazas. The complete absence of a written record from its people means we are left interpreting the silent language of post holes, soil layers, and discarded artifacts. There was no single invasion, no recorded epidemic that explains the departure. Instead, Cahokia presents a classic case of a complex society hitting its ecological and social limits. It grew too large, too fast, on an agricultural foundation that proved vulnerable to climatic shifts. When those shifts occurred, the centralized political structure could not adapt quickly enough, leading to a loss of faith, the fracturing of communal bonds, and a strategic retreat to a simpler, more decentralized way of life. The great mounds remain not as tombs of a conquered people, but as monuments to a bold experiment in urban living that the land, and perhaps the people themselves, ultimately chose to end. While Cahokia's earthen mounds stood exposed on an open plain, another civilization sought sanctuary in the very bones of the earth. Carved into the sheer sandstone cliffs of the American Southwest, the intricate stone cities of Mesa Verde hang like abandoned swallows' nests, a breathtaking testament to the ancestral Puebloan people. These were not primitive caves, but sophisticated, multi-story apartment complexes with hundreds of rooms, carefully constructed kivas for ceremonial life, and clever systems to channel precious rainwater. For generations, these cliff dwellings offered protection, community, and a profound connection to a dramatic landscape. The enduring mystery, however, is not why they built there, but why, quite suddenly around the year 1300, they left. Every major cliff dwelling across the region was completely abandoned within a generation, the rooms emptied of all but a few ceremonial objects, the hearths grown cold. This was not a haphazard flight, but a coordinated, total exodus. The key to understanding this great departure lies not in a single disaster, but in a slow tightening of environmental and social pressures that made this once sustainable way of life impossible. The most undeniable force was the climate. Studies of ancient tree rings from the region paint a stark picture, revealing a devastating 24-year megadrought that began in 1276. For a culture living on the edge of a high desert, dependent on precise cycles of snowfall and summer rains to nourish their maize, beans, and squash, this was a catastrophe in slow motion. Springs dried up, seeps vanished, and carefully tended fields on the mesa tops above the cliffs withered season after desperate season. The very logic of the cliff dwelling, with its defensive position and thermal stability, began to crumble when the primary threat was no longer external raiders, but a relentless, thirsty sky. This environmental crisis amplified every other vulnerability. Centuries of living in the same area had gradually depleted the most accessible resources. The forests on the mesa tops, source of crucial timber for construction and fuel, were likely overharvested. Game animals became scarce, and the soil, farmed intensively for generations, may have lost its fertility. The population, which had grown during wetter centuries, was now too large for the land's diminished capacity to support. As scarcity grew, so did social tension. The cliff dwellings themselves, with their limited space and difficult access, suggest a society turning inward, perhaps fracturing into smaller, more defensive family groups. Archaeologists find evidence of blocked-up doorways and changes in settlement patterns that hint at conflict, not with outside enemies, but between communities competing for the last reliable sources of water and arable land. The social glue that held these tight-knit villages together was being stressed to its breaking point by hunger and thirst. Yet the story of Mesa Verde is not one of a people vanishing into nothingness. It is a story of strategic migration. The archaeological and oral historical record shows a deliberate movement south and southeast toward the Rio Grande and Little Colorado River drainages. Here, rivers provided a more reliable water source. The people did not disappear, they regrouped, joining with other Pueblo communities and adapting their rich cultural traditions to new landscapes. Their departure from the cliffs was therefore a conscious choice, a difficult but rational response to changing conditions. They left behind empty stone cities as a monument not to defeat, but to resilience, choosing a future of continuity in a new home over a futile struggle against a deepening drought in an exhausted land. The silent cliff palaces stand not as tombs, but as waypoints in an ancient journey, reminding us that sometimes the ultimate act of a civilization is not to stand its ground until the end, but to know when it is time to gather its people and walk toward water. But the story of stone cities in southern Africa did not end with Great Zimbabwe. Nearly 200 kilometers to the southwest, in a landscape of granite hills and balancing boulders, a second, later capital rose to prominence, known today as the Great Enclosure of Kami. This was the heart of the Torwa state and later the Roswi Changamaya dynasty, a civilization that emerged as the successor to Great Zimbabwe's legacy. While inspired by their predecessor, the builders of Kami developed a distinct architectural signature. Instead of free-standing walls, they masterfully adapted to the existing granite topography, constructing terraced platforms and retaining walls that followed the natural contours of the hill. Upon these terraces, they built enclosures and homes using a sophisticated technique called checkerboard or herringbone stonework, creating stunning decorative patterns in the walls that shimmered in the sunlight. This was not merely a fortress, but a complex capital city with separate areas for royalty, artisans, and spiritual ceremonies, all integrated into the living rock. It spoke of a society that had refined the stone-building tradition into a high art, maintaining a powerful kingdom centered on cattle wealth and regional trade for centuries. Its abandonment, however, presents a different kind of mystery than the slow dispersal from Great Zimbabwe. Kami's end came relatively swiftly in the early 19th century, and its story illustrates how a resilient political center can be shattered by converging historical storms. The primary shockwave originated from the southeast, with the meteoric rise of the Zulu kingdom under Shaka. The intense militarization and expansion of the Zulu state, beginning in the 18 teens, triggered massive waves of displacement and conflict across southern Africa, a period known as the Emphican. As larger groups were displaced, they in turn put pressure on their neighbors, creating a domino effect of instability that reached deep into the interior. The Razwi kingdom, for all its architectural sophistication, was likely destabilized by these rippling population movements and the warfare they brought. The capital's intricate terraces and walls, designed for ceremony and prestige, may have offered little defense against this new scale of organized conflict. Into this atmosphere of upheaval came a second, ultimately decisive pressure: European colonial expansion from the south. Portuguese traders from Mozambique and later Boer trekkers and British colonists were increasingly penetrating the interior, seeking land, minerals, and political control. These colonial forces often formed alliances with some local groups against others, further fracturing the regional power balance. The combination proved fatal for the Razwi state. By the 1830s, the great enclosure of Komi was abandoned. The most direct cause appears to have been an invasion by Nguni groups displaced by the Zulu expansion, who swept through the area. The royal line was dispersed, the centralized authority broken. In the ensuing power vacuum, colonial settlers consolidated control over the territory. Unlike the earlier abandonment of Great Zimbabwe, which seems to have been a strategic migration, the fall of Komi was a political termination. The external shocks of the Emphican and colonial encroachment did not just encourage people to leave, they actively dismantled the kingdom itself, preventing any reorganization or return. The beautiful patterned walls were left to the elements, a silent testament to a sophisticated culture whose time was ended not by a slow environmental fade, but by the abrupt collision of historical forces far beyond its borders. The patterned walls of Komi were silenced by distant political storms, but in South India, a capital of unimaginable scale met its end in a single, thunderous battle. Vijayanagara, the city of victory, was the dazzling heart of an empire that dominated the Indian peninsula for more than 2 centuries. To approach this city was to enter a landscape of myth made real, where colossal boulders seemed to defy gravity and temples were carved directly into the living rock. Its rulers poured wealth into a metropolis of towering gopurams, bustling bazaars that traded diamonds and spices, and an ingenious system of canals and tanks that turned a rocky basin into a fertile garden. This was a place of immense sacred and royal power, a final, glorious bastion of Hindu kingdom in an age of expanding sultanates to the north. Its destruction, therefore, was not a quiet fading, but a cataclysm so complete it shocked observers across the Indian Ocean. In 1565, a colossal army formed by a coalition of rival Deccan sultanates met the forces of Vijayanagara on the plains at Talikota. The battle was a decisive disaster for the empire. The victorious sultanate forces then marched on the capital itself, subjecting it to a systematic and merciless sack that lasted for months. Temples were desecrated, palaces were pulled down, and the intricate hydraulic systems were shattered. The city of victory was reduced to a field of ruins so vast and poignant they are known today simply as Hampi, a hauntingly beautiful archaeological site. The mystery, however, lies not in the violence of the sack, but in why this single military defeat proved so utterly fatal to the entire empire. How could a state of such apparent strength disintegrate so completely after one lost battle? The answer is found in the empire's own political architecture. Vijayanagara was less a tightly centralized state and more a grand coalition of powerful, semi-independent regional lords known as Nayakas. Their loyalty to the emperor in the capital was maintained through a complex web of martial prestige, royal patronage, and shared religious devotion. This system created a magnificent court and enabled military expansion, but it also bred latent rivalries and competition. When the emperor at Talikota, Alia Rama Raya, was captured and executed on the battlefield, it did more than decapitate the army. It severed the crucial symbolic cord that held the coalition together. With a central source of patronage and authority suddenly gone, the bonds of loyalty dissolved almost instantly. The powerful Nayakas, rather than rallying to defend the heartland, largely retreated to their own regional territories to secure their personal power bases. There was no deep, bureaucratic state or national identity that could outlive the royal figurehead. The capital was not just an administrative center, it was the empire's spiritual and symbolic nucleus, and its fall was seen as a divine judgment, an irreversible end. Furthermore, the empire's constant military stance against the northern sultanates, while a source of its identity, had also created a precarious balance of power. The coalition assembled against Vijayanagara at Talikota was unprecedented, a momentary sinking of differences among its rivals that created an overwhelming force. The empire's structure, optimized for projecting power outward through its feudatory lords, proved brittle when faced with a unified external shock and the simultaneous removal of its central authority. The ruins of Hampi, therefore, tell a story of spectacular fragility beneath the grandeur. They stand as a monument to a civilization that mastered art, architecture, and hydraulics, but whose political foundations were ultimately personal, not institutional, leaving a kingdom that could win victories for generations, but could not survive the loss of a single fateful day. The ruins of Hampi stand as a monument to a single catastrophic day. But what about a capital that was abandoned not by force, but by a simple, fatal oversight? In the dry plains of northern India, the red sandstone walls of Fatehpur Sikri rise with an air of perfect, silent preservation. This was the dream city of the Mughal Emperor Akbar, one of history's most powerful and visionary rulers. At the height of his reign in the late 16th century, flush with victory and seeking a new spiritual direction, Akbar chose this site to build a brand new capital from scratch. The result was a masterpiece of fusion architecture, blending Persian, Indian, and Central Asian styles into a harmonious sandstone city of palaces, pavilions, and a majestic congregational mosque. It was designed as a physical manifestation of Akbar's inclusive philosophy, a place of power, learning, and religious discourse. And yet, just 14 years after its grand completion, this magnificent capital was completely and permanently abandoned. The mystery of Fatehpur Sikri is not one of war or rebellion, but of a single, glaring logistical error made with all the resources of an empire at one's command. The city's fatal flaw was its water supply. Built on a rocky ridge, the location was chosen for its strategic and spiritual significance, following a prediction by a Sufi saint that Akbar would have a long-awaited heir if he built there. The prediction came true, and the grateful emperor poured his empire's wealth into the project. Engineers constructed an ingenious system of reservoirs, step wells, and a vast artificial lake to capture and store monsoon rains. For a time, it worked, but the system was precariously dependent on the consistent, abundant rainfall of a few months to sustain a population of nobles, soldiers, artisans, and servants for the entire year. When a series of drier than normal seasons occurred, the complex water infrastructure proved inadequate. The reservoirs and the Great Lake began to shrink. The logistical challenge of supplying water to a major capital in this location became a daily crisis. For all his military genius and administrative skill, Akbar had fundamentally miscalculated the relationship between his grand vision and the environmental reality of the site. An empire that could move armies across continents and commission timeless art could not make it rain. Faced with a chronic, unresolvable water shortage, the emperor made a pragmatic, if astonishing, decision. Around 1585, he simply ordered the court to pack up and move the entire imperial administration back to the previous capital, Agra, which had reliable access to the perennial Yamuna River. Overnight, Fatehpur Sikri transformed from a bustling capital into a ghost city. Its palaces never saw decay from battle or plunder. They were simply vacated, left in a state of arrested perfection. This makes it one of history's most poignant ruins, a city that died not from external violence, but from an internal flaw in its very conception. It stands as a profound lesson in the limits of even absolute power, a reminder that the most brilliant human plans can be undone by something as basic and unforgiving as a lack of water, leaving behind a beautiful, empty shell where an emperor's dream briefly took form before evaporating into the dry air. The silent perfection of a planned capital gives way to a city reclaimed by the very sands it once mastered. Far to the east, along the southern branch of the Silk Road, the oasis of Niya was a vital green jewel in a sea of sand, a bustling administrative center for the ancient kingdom of Crorena. For centuries, its poplar trees provided shade, its river gave life, and its position made it a crucial way station where caravans could rest, resupply, and trade goods from across the known world. Then the desert swallowed it whole, burying its secrets under dunes for over 1,000 years until explorers in the early 20th century made a startling discovery. They found not just ruins but a city frozen in time. The arid climate had acted as a perfect preservative. Wooden buildings still stood with their doorframes intact. Ancient orchards of peach and apricot trees, long dead, remained eerily upright in the desiccated earth. Most astonishingly, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of administrative documents written on wooden tablets and leather, sealed with clay, detailing the mundane yet vivid life of the city, tax records, legal disputes, military orders, even private letters. These texts, written in the Kharosthi script, revealed Niya as a vibrant, multicultural hub, a place where diverse peoples lived under a complex bureaucracy. This makes its end not a mystery of warfare, but a slow, suffocating tragedy written in the changing landscape itself. The cause of Niya's abandonment was almost certainly environmental, a process of desertification that gradually choked the life from the oasis. The city's existence was a fragile bargain with the Niya River, which brought glacial meltwater down from the distant Kunlun Mountains. Over time, that bargain broke. Research suggests the river's course began to shift, possibly due to tectonic activity or the natural silting of its channels. Simultaneously, a broader climatic trend towards aridity in the Tarim Basin likely reduced the overall water flow. The irrigation canals that fed Niya's fields and gardens would have run dry one by one. The poplar trees whose roots stabilized the soil would have died. Without the trees, the encroaching dunes of the Taklamakan Desert, whose name ominously translates to place of no return, would have advanced unchecked, literally burying the outskirts of the city. We can picture the slow, grinding crisis, a decade of slightly lower river flow. A canal on the city's edge fails and a farm is abandoned, then another. The tax records would have shown declining yields. The letters perhaps mentioned dust storms growing more frequent. The cost of maintaining the complex irrigation system may have outstripped the dwindling profits from the Silk Road trade, especially as routes subtly shifted to more reliable oases. There was no dramatic siege, no final battle at the gates. Instead, the administration likely made a series of difficult, practical decisions. The wooden tablets show a gradual winding down of official activity. Finally, the remaining population faced an inevitable choice: stay and fight a losing battle against the sand, or gather what they could and follow the receding water to a new home. They chose to leave. The final, poignant image is of a city not destroyed but simply vacated, its documents carefully archived, its homes left as they were, as if the owners intended to return after a season that never ended. The desert did the rest, sealing Niya in a dry tomb. Its collapse is a profound lesson in the silent power of environmental change. demonstrating how the slow shift of a river or the relentless advance of dunes could erase a thriving capital from the map and from memory, leaving only wooden tablets in the sand to whisper of the life that once flourished there. The silent, shifting sands that buried Niya tell a story of slow environmental suffocation, but some cities faced a far more brutal and definitive punctuation mark. At the crossroads of the Silk Road in Central Asia, the oasis of Merv was not just a city, it was a palimpsest of empires, a place that was destroyed and reborn from its own ashes multiple times across millennia. At its zenith in the 12th century under the Seljuk Turks, Merv was a global metropolis, a center of scholarship, trade, and staggering wealth, with a population that may have approached 500,000, making it one of the largest cities on Earth. Its libraries were legendary, its markets brimmed with goods from China to the Mediterranean, and its sophisticated underground irrigation canals, called kanats, turned the desert margin into a fertile garden. This was a capital of learning and luxury, a crown jewel of the civilized world. Then, in 1221, the Mongol general Tolui, son of Genghis Khan, arrived at its gates. The city surrendered, hoping for mercy, but the Mongol policy for resistance, real or perceived, was absolute. What followed was an event of such calculated, systematic horror that it seared itself into history. The entire population was marched onto the plains outside the city. Soldiers then methodically divided the people into groups, and over the course of several days, executed nearly every man, woman, and child. Contemporary accounts, though likely exaggerated, speak of hundreds of thousands lost. The physical city was then razed, its libraries burned, its kanats shattered. This was not a conquest, it was an erasure, a deliberate attempt to wipe a rival center of power and culture from the map. The event is so stark, so total, that it seems to provide the simplest possible explanation for a city's end, a single, cataclysmic act of violence. Yet the deeper mystery of Merv is why this time, unlike after its previous destructions by Arabs or others, it never truly recovered. Why did this phoenix finally fail to rise? The Mongol devastation was the immediate, overwhelming cause, a demographic and cultural gutting from which no society could quickly heal. But to understand its permanent decline, we must look at the changing world that surrounded the empty oasis in the centuries that followed. The Mongol conquests themselves radically reshaped the very trade routes that had been Merv's lifeblood. While the Pax Mongolica later facilitated trade across Eurasia, it often favored northern routes that bypassed the traditional southern Silk Road corridors where Merv sat. The center of economic gravity in the region began to shift. Furthermore, the political landscape was irrevocably altered. New power centers emerged under the Mongol Ilkhanate and later the Timurid Empire, with splendid capitals like Samarkand and Herat drawing away the talent, investment, and royal patronage that had once flowed to Merv. There was no longer a powerful, resident sultanate with a vested interest in rebuilding the city to its former glory. The immense labor and resources required to restore the shattered Khanate network and rebuild the urban fabric were simply not forthcoming from new rulers focused elsewhere. The environment itself may have had the final say. Some scholars suggest that maintaining the delicate oasis ecology required a large, organized population and a strong central authority to manage the water system. The Mongol destruction broke that cycle of maintenance irreparably. Without people to tend them, the Khanats silted up and collapsed. Without the Khanats, the agricultural base that could support a major city vanished. The desert began to reclaim its own. So, while the Mongols delivered the killing blow, it was the confluence of that blow with longer-term geopolitical shifts and the fragile ecology of an oasis city that cemented Merv's fate. It became a ghost not just because its people were gone, but because the reasons for its existence, the trade routes, the political will, and the managed landscape had all moved on. The Great Silk Road metropolis was left as a vast, silent complex of crumbling mud brick walls, a testament to the terrifying power of a single day's decision and the slow, patient forces that can ensure a city never wakes from that nightmare. Out in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, a civilization performed a miracle of engineering on a scale that seems to defy its surroundings. On the eastern shore of Pohnpei Island, the ruins of Nan Madol rise from a shallow lagoon, a network of nearly 100 artificial islets constructed from colossal basalt logs and boulders. This was the ceremonial and political seat of the Çatalhöyük dynasty, a line of rulers who unified the island for centuries. To call it the Venice of the Pacific is to undersell its alien majesty, for this was not a city of canals, but a city that was itself a canal, a labyrinth of waterways separating royal compounds, priestly enclosures, and ritual spaces, all built atop coral fill. The sheer physical effort involved is almost incomprehensible. Each of the massive stone columns, some weighing many tons, was quarried from the opposite side of the island and transported, likely by raft, across the open sea before being painstakingly lifted into place. For generations, an entire society mobilized its labor and will to wrest this stone fantasy from the water, creating a capital that was deliberately set apart, both physically and symbolically, from the common people and the fertile land. This very isolation, however, may have been the seed of its undoing. Nan Madol's abandonment is a mystery wrapped in the legends of Pohnpei, which tell of a tyrannical Çatalhöyük ruler overthrown by a hero from a neighboring island. While the specifics are myth, the underlying theme of political upheaval is powerful. Archaeologists see evidence that points to a more gradual, systemic collapse. The concentration of the entire elite and their supporting population on these artificial islets created a profound logistical burden. Every piece of food, every drop of fresh water, every resource had to be brought in by canoe from the main island. This was a capital on life support, utterly dependent on the loyalty and surplus of the outlying communities. Over time, the strain of maintaining this monumental complex, of feeding its inhabitants and continuing the endless labor of upkeep, may have simply become too great. The system demanded too much from the land and the people. Furthermore, the symbolic distance of the rulers in their stone enclave, separated by water from the world they governed, could have fostered resentment and a dangerous disconnect. When challenges arose, whether environmental stresses like changing sea levels or shifts in agricultural yields, the isolated elite may have been unable to respond effectively, their authority crumbling as the practical needs of the population went unmet. The magnificent stone city, a testament to unity and absolute power, likely fell not to a sudden invasion, but to a slow severing of the social contract that had built it, leaving the silent, seaweed-draped islets as a haunting monument to the peril of building a world too far removed from the one that sustains it. On the most isolated inhabited island on Earth, a different kind of cliff face became the stage for a civilization's final, desperate act. High on the rim of the Orongo volcano, overlooking a vast ocean on one side and a depleted island on the other, the ceremonial village of Orongo is a place of stark and haunting beauty. Here, 53 low stone houses are built seamlessly into the rock, facing out toward 3 tiny, treacherous islets. This was not a capital of administration or trade, but of last-ditch spiritual hope, the center of the Tangata Manu or birdman cult. In the final centuries of Rapa Nui's complex society, as the great stone moai statues ceased to be erected, the focus of power and prestige violently shifted. Each year, contenders chosen by powerful chiefs would descend the sheer 300-meter cliff, swim through shark-infested waters, and race to be the first to collect a sacred sooty-turned egg from the islet of Matu Nui. The winner, whose patron chief became the birdman for the year, was believed to channel the fertility and favor of the god Make. This perilous ritual, born in a time of profound crisis, symbolizes a society turning from collective monument building to a more desperate, competitive quest for divine intervention. The story of Easter Island has long been told as the ultimate parable of ecocide, a warning etched into a treeless landscape. The traditional narrative is compelling in its stark simplicity. A Polynesian society arriving around 1200 years ago flourished in isolation, developing a unique culture centered on carving and transporting hundreds of colossal moai, likely representing deified ancestors. This undertaking required immense resources, especially timber for rollers and levers, and ropes made from the inner bark of the giant jubia palm. Over centuries, the story goes, the population grew, the forests were cleared for agriculture and statue transport, and the trees never returned. Without wood, islanders could no longer build fishing canoes to access deep water fish, leading to protein scarcity. Soil erosion from deforestation ruined farmland. The society, trapped on their 64-square-mile island with no escape, descended into a brutal period of resource wars, toppling each other's statues in a frenzy of inter-clan violence. In this telling, Orongo and its dangerous birdman cult represent the grim, spiritualized culmination of that collapse, a society now competing for the blessings of birds because it had destroyed the foundations of its own world. Recent archaeological and historical research, however, has complicated this elegant morality tale, painting a picture that is both more nuanced and, in some ways, more tragic. While deforestation certainly occurred and played a major role in societal change, evidence suggests the islanders were remarkably adaptable, not blindly self-destructive. Studies of garden walls and stone mulch systems show they developed sophisticated techniques to nourish the soil and grow sweet potatoes in poor conditions. The population before European contact may have been smaller and more stable than once thought. Critically, the famous toppling of the moai may not have been solely an act of warfare, but perhaps a systematic, ritualized closing of an old religious order, making way for the new birdman ideology centered at Orongo. The society was transforming, not necessarily spiraling into chaos. The final, devastating blow likely came from outside the island's ecosystem. The first recorded European contact by Dutch explorers in 1722 introduced not just new ideas, but new pathogens to which the Rapa Nui people had no immunity. Subsequent visits by Spanish, British, and other explorers brought more disease, along with violence and social disruption. Then, in the 19th century, the true horror arrived. Peruvian slave raiders abducted or killed around half the remaining population in a single series of raids in 1862. Introduced diseases like smallpox ravaged the survivors. This series of external shocks, not internal ecological failure alone, catastrophically collapsed the social structure, shattered cultural knowledge, and reduced the population to a mere handful. The silent moai and the empty stone houses of Orongo thus stand at the center of a heated historical debate. Were they monuments to a society that committed ecological suicide, or to one that was adapting to its limits with ingenuity, only to be brutally dismantled by forces from a world it never chose to join? The answer reshapes this remote capital from a simple cautionary tale into a deeply contested microcosm of all collapse, a reminder that the end of a world is rarely written by one hand alone. These 25 silent capitals whisper a chorus of recurring warnings, a set of patterns that emerge from the dust of separated centuries and continents. Environmental stress is the most haunting refrain, a slow, insistent pressure that appears again and again, from the shifting rivers of Mohenjo-daro and the droughts of Tikal to the exhausted soil of Cahokia and the choked canals of Angkor. These were not sudden ice ages or asteroid strikes, but subtle, persistent changes in rainfall, river courses, or soil fertility that gradually tilted the balance from abundance to scarcity. They reveal that a civilization's greatest achievement is often its most fragile, a complex system built for a specific climate that can falter when that climate decides to change the rules. Alongside this, we see the recurring strain of social inequality, the dangerous gap between a ruling elite and the population that supports them. In places like Teotihuacan and Cahokia, the very monuments that proclaimed power may have become symbols of an unbearable burden, especially when combined with environmental hardship. A social contract can endure prosperity, but it is tested to breaking point by shared scarcity. Yet for every pattern, there is a confounding paradox, a contradiction that defies any simple checklist for collapse. Consider the central paradox of political structure. A highly centralized state like the Assyrian Empire with its heart in Nineveh could mobilize immense resources and project terrifying power. But this very centralization became its fatal flaw, for when the capital fell, the entire system had no backup, no secondary center of loyalty to rally around, and thus vanished completely. Conversely, a more decentralized or federated structure, like the Maya city-states or the Vijayanagara Empire with its powerful regional lords, could be more resilient to the loss of a single node. But this diffusion of power carried its own peril, making coordinated response to a widespread crisis like a drought far more difficult, and often turning competition for dwindling resources into fratricidal warfare. There is no perfect formula, only trade-offs where a society's greatest strength in one era can become its most critical vulnerability in the next. This leads to the second great paradox, the inconsistent role of external enemies. In some cases, like Nineveh or Vijayanagara, a military defeat at the hands of a powerful coalition was the definitive, catastrophic event. Yet for every Hattusa sacked by invaders, there is a Çatalhöyük that faded without a trace of conflict, or a great Zimbabwe abandoned in peace. Often, the most destructive enemy was not the army at the gates, but the slow, internal unraveling of faith and purpose. A lost battle might be the final blow, but it is rarely the sole cause. It is the event that capitalizes on weaknesses that were decades or even centuries in the making. The true collapse almost always occurs in the minds of the people first, in the lost belief that the system, whether led by kings, priests, or merchants, can provide security and meaning. And this brings us to the ultimate insight these ruins offer, the consistent failure of the monocausal explanation. We are storytellers by nature, craving clear narratives with a single villain, a drought, an invasion, a foolish king. But history, in its messy reality, refuses to cooperate. What we see in case after case is not a single domino falling, but a cascade, a lethal synergy where multiple pressures amplify one another. A drought weakens agriculture, which sparks social unrest and political fragmentation, which in turn cripples the coordinated response needed to manage the drought, leaving the society vulnerable to a raid or an internal revolt that becomes the final act. The collapse is in the interaction, the feedback loops where environmental, social, economic, and political systems become entangled in a downward spiral. This is why comparing two cities that faced similar droughts can yield opposite outcomes. One adapts and survives, the other shatters. The difference lies not in the stressor itself, but in the resilience of the social fabric, the flexibility of its institutions, and the wisdom of its responses when the world they knew began to change. These silent stones, therefore, do not offer a simple manual for survival. They offer a profound lesson in humility, reminding us that civilizations are not destroyed. They are unmade, thread by thread, by the complex and often invisible interplay of the world they built and the world that changed around them. So the stones remain, and the questions linger, not as a sign of our ignorance, but as a testament to the profound complexity of human society. The collapse of a great capital is never a simple story of a barbarian at the gate or a single cataclysmic disaster. It is a slow, multifaceted unraveling, a series of quiet failures that intertwine until the entire structure becomes unsustainable. In the moment, it is often invisible, a gradual tightening of pressure felt in poorer harvests, in whispered doubts about leaders, in the slow silting of a crucial canal. The final event, the battle or the fire or the departure, is merely the punctuation on a sentence that was written over generations. These mysteries teach us that the true measure of a civilization's strength is not its monuments or its armies in a time of plenty, but the resilience of its social bonds and the adaptability of its institutions when the world inevitably changes. They show us that fragility and resilience are two sides of the same coin, and that the most enduring legacy may not be a city that stands forever, but the wisdom to know when to adapt, when to disperse, and when to build anew. We are left not with answers, but with a deeper appreciation for the quiet forces that shape history. Now we turn to you. Of these 25 enigmatic capitals, which story lingers most in your mind? Is it the silent rooftop exodus from Çatalhöyük, the revolutionary fire in the heart of Teotihuacan, or the pragmatic abandonment of a waterless dream at Fatehpur Sikri? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know which of these lost worlds you would most want to explore further. Your curiosity is the first step in keeping their stories alive.